Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm James Didarian. I direct the Center for International Security Studies here at the University of Sydney, which stands on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to acknowledge all elders, past, present, and emerging. It's really my pleasure to host our first CIS webinar with a very, very special guest, Professor Sheila Jasanoff, who is the Pforzheimer Professor of Science Technology Studies at Harvard, at the Kennedy School, I believe.
Yes.
An interdisciplinary school, which is fitting for an interdisciplinary topic. I've read many of her books. One in particular has stuck with me and greatly informed my current investigations into quantum technologies, the ethics of invention, which we will be investigating today. Now, she has many honors, many prizes, the Hirschman Prize. She's received, most recently, I think, the Holberg Prize, which is probably the most prestigious prize of the social sciences and humanities and I believe, law. She's in good company with Jürgen Habermas, I know, and Martha Nussbaum and Bruno Latour. So that's a great honor. And we feel particularly fortunate to have her here today to talk about the ethics of anticipation, which I think I'm going to start by asking you to, how did you get this title, this theme, this idea, and how does it relate to emerging technologies? And particularly the word ethics, which comes, laden with many, many values.
Yes, so James, thanks first of all, for the invitation. It's a delight to see you and my Australian friends again and to have this opportunity. The question is complicated because there's a strange history to the emergence of that book. A few years ago, a publisher from Norton came to talk to me about the fact that Amnesty International was wanting to reinvent itself after the Cold War. So what were Amnesty's new foci in the area of human rights going to be? And they wanted a series of books that would talk about emerging rights, so that the position of the human in this century would be redefined, and with that, Amnesty's own role. And they were prescient, and when Norton suggested obvious topics like climate and human rights, and Amnesty said they wanted a book about technology. The publisher was very skeptical, did not think that there was any correlation between technology and human rights. But the overall series director was Anthony Appio, who was a well-known ethicist. And apparently he referred them to me to try to figure out what to do. So here was this triangulation from the start that was quite odd. A publisher that didn't have any faith in the project and didn't actually think there was subject matter there. An NGO that had the foresight to think that technology and human rights actually were intimately connected, and then a very open agenda. What was I actually supposed to write about? So, of course, there has been a discussion of technology and ethics for a long time, usually looking at the end point. So a technology lands in human lives, it has unintended consequences, as the saying goes, and those are often negative, and how do you forestall them? And that's usually a debate that's carried out under the heading of risk. So I knew from the start this was something I had to avoid. That is, I didn't want simply to write another tract on how to include marginalized voices in debates on risk.
Right.
But then I had to imagine really what would a 21st century set of thoughts about ethics and rights in relation to technologies look like. And I was swayed at the time by the discussion on convergent technologies, which I'm sure you have been as well. So instead of dividing up the world as technology A in column A and technology B in column B, a lot of people were recognizing by the turn of the century that this is going to be a century in which all of these technologies are going to come together in unpredictable ways. And I think this was clear even 10, 15 years ago and has become even more clear. So that part was plain to me from the outset that this is a shifting technological territory, but how to articulate questions of rights was still a bit mysterious. And then I thought of a sentence that an anthropologist friend of mine once just threw away. He was from South Asia, and he said, what the West should learn is that their past is not our future. So that was an interesting sentence. And I had been thinking, in any case, in my work on sociotechnical imaginaries, about the connection between histories and futures. And to some extent, it seemed to me that the post-colonial project is not really going to be post-colonial till one severs this tie between one group's history and another group's future. So that led me to the juncture where then I came up with this invented term, ethics of anticipation. But let me throw it back to you.
Well, you've certainly thrown back a great deal for me to investigate. I mean, first of all, congratulations on finding support for investigations into the future. Too often we tag that as futuristic or futurist, and
right.
It's a way to demean academic study of the future, which I think is one of the most important topics. And I think you nailed it in your book. Certainly, you anticipated many of the convergences, particularly with the genome project, but nuclear energy, and you go through it in your chapters of your book, for instance, of the ethics of invention. But what really struck with your response is how there's also a cultural issue about how we define the future. I mean, I'm sort of of the Yogi Berra school that the future ain't what it used to be. It never is. We pretend that it's continuous and linear because it makes sense in that Newtonian kind of comforting way. But obviously, the future is already here in some places, not arrived or never going to arrive, or it's going to be completely different in other places. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit, about how, the very idea of the future is culturally informed, that we shouldn't think of as, you do a great critique of technological determinism. So I'm going to throw that back at you as well, three potential themes that you might want to take a look at.
Well, one of my bugbears actually is not so much determinism as this term unintended consequences, because it depersonalizes the future, consequences being this stuff that's out there. And if you say they're unintended, it's almost as if people are responding in a sort of common law system to the idea that if it was not intentional, then you can't hold people responsible. Right? I mean, so there's some gray zone there of negligence or whatever, but as soon as you say a technology's consequences are unintended, you're actually taking responsibility off of the shoulders of, ironically, the very people who are designing those technologies. And we've now, because of the compression of time around information technologies, had the opportunity to see how that displacement of responsibility works. And so everybody today is talking about social media consequences. You and I were discussing a little bit the anomie of the post-Zoom era or post-pandemic era, in which people have become attached to not seeing each other and not being in their workplaces and so on and so forth. So what is meant by saying that this is unintended? Whose anticipation was it that these kinds of things would happen, and whose anticipation was it not? I mean, so, if you substitute unanticipated for unintended, you can ask a series of social science questions about that. What is it that kept people from having a particular imagination? And, you were talking about linearity. In most of the quantitative social sciences, there is a strong purchase into the idea that the next data point will follow, from a certain pattern. It doesn't matter that philosophers, Wittgenstein among others, have told us forever that there isn't a laid down trajectory, that the next point is not fully determined. Yeah. And you, as a quantum student, will obviously have particular sensibilities about that. Nevertheless, the whole idea of the idea of risk assessment, for instance, is premised on the idea that we know what the next step will be. And what we already knew is a sufficient determiner. We can do good enough modeling. We can set loose these cars that are going to drive themselves on the basis of the data that we've programmed in. And with the rise of big data, the hubris of that kind of understanding is growing, ever stronger. So it was into that sort of gray zone of some people believing that their anticipation, their ways of imagining the future should be, well, first of all, are adequate, are good enough to take the next step. Because after all, life is always uncertain. Inventors will tell you that.
Yeah.
You can't demand full certainty. But where does that sense of good enoughness come from? And whose good enoughness is it? And what counts? So it's that set of problems that I was wanting to investigate from an ethical standpoint. That is not just the question of epistemic uncertainty, how much do we need to know to responsibly act for the future, but also what do we need to know? Which data points are we ignoring? Which ones are we taking on board? That's where the ethical questions lie.
Well, you dangled a very, very appealing line of thought when you brought up the quantum views on these issues, which we might get into. But first one way is to talk about uncertainties. Certainly progress implies uncertainty. Science runs on uncertainty. But the sort of Cartesian model, or which we put the linear model, is quite different from the quantum one. The quantum one puts much more responsibility on the individual because every time you reduce uncertainty by making a choice, an observation, or a measurement, you're now responsible for it because you've collapsed the wave function. That's one possible interpretation, the quantum one. But I want to go back to the something that is in your ethics of, invention, and it relates to risk and how it relates to geopolitics and indeed what's often billed as unintended consequences or actions of politicians, okay? And in this case, you used that haiku of Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense at the time of the disastrous war of Iraq, and he's being asked in a press conference, well, isn't this turning into a fiasco? And he said the famous line about we have known knowns, unknowns. That was a pivot point, I thought, in the book. Could you unpack that for us, why you saw that as part of this problematique of how it gives an out for, politicians to claim that we can never know?
Right. Well, Rumsfeld himself is a pretty interesting character because I think that there were depths in that guy. He understood and evaded responsibility in all kinds of ways. And I've always been struck when people speaking ordinary political talk suddenly manage to say things that sound like they're a rhetoric from a different universe. Yeah. But the epistemic category that he was inventing, the unknowns, it first of all, it appeals to a political scientist's desire to make 2x2 matrices and populate all of the holes. But for an STS scholar, as I am, the immediate question that arises is the question of agency. And so unknown to whom and unknown why. There is a kind of universalizing move to saying this thing is simply unknown. But we know from the history of science and technology that a lot of things are known because there were particular purposes to be served and people funded the research to go there and not go to other places. And, the first atomic age, one of the origin points for today's quantum thinking as well. If America had not decided to put money into doing atoms with bomb making in their sights, then people would have discovered the potential of the atom anyway. But possibly the ways in which institutions sprang up, the order in which people started to think about things, would not have been the same. The pressure to invent a separate use, or a separate use as was claimed, namely atoms for peace, would not have happened without a tacit embrace of atoms for war that came ahead of that. So I think the thing that's often missing in analyzing responsibility is that institutional level at which purposes are being set for society and then the technologies are being channeled into it. And those purposes include all kinds of assumptions about who should be held responsible if things go wrong or not. I mean, so I've done, as you know, a lot of comparative work between Europe and the US. And these are like nations. They have similar forms of government, the same histories, often even the same legal systems and so forth. But the question of who bears responsibility for something that goes wrong is really quite radically different between, say, a Germany and a US. And I think that one of the things I've tried to do in my work is call attention to the fact that those are not neutral choices. So how you put the dial of your society to say, well, things may go wrong, but if they do, then is that a problem for the collective or is that a problem for the individual? That is a profoundly ethical moment. It doesn't require you to know in advance what's going to happen, but it says if the thing breaks the wrong way, then who will be left holding the bag?
That certainly was the takeaway from, I think, one of the most powerful takeaways from the Oppenheimer film, is that, the physics community was split on this question, obviously. To use the bomb for Germany, as close as you can get to absolute evil at the time, but not to use it then when the war in Europe ends, and then to use it in Japan. There's a whole controversy over whether or not that was more intended to, deter the Soviet Union. But what's interesting is something that Niels Bohr said from the very beginning. It's interesting because Niels Bohr wrote the article on nuclear fission in 1939, September 1st, with John Wheeler Bennett from Princeton. And he said, that this has this potential. And Szilard and Einstein had written a letter to Roosevelt about warning about this potential. So people did know. They knew evil, as Oppenheimer put it. And one of the first things Niels Bohr said is we have to change our institutions for this new weapon. But that went nowhere. Well, with very short beginnings in the UN and the Atoms for Peace, as you said. But it went, do we need something like that now for the next threat? I mean, we just had, many artificial intelligence scientists, in fact, some of the inventors, write this letter saying this has the risk of extinction, generative artificial intelligence. Is it this the moment now? Is this our Oppenheimer moment, our Einstein moment, our Bohr's moment?
Well, of course, one has to worry about hype.
Yes.
When talking about extinctions as well as
I believe they likened
moments.
it to pandemic and nuclear.
Right, but I think that the real problems go back to the political questions. You say Niels Bohr and his call for institutions went nowhere. I'm always skeptical about whether things go nowhere or whether they germinate in odd ways. And, we could come back to those kinds of questions. After all, a quite brilliant play was written about Bohr meeting with Heisenberg and, what...
Copenhagen, yes.
Copenhagen, yes.
Michael Frayn, brilliant, yeah.
Right. But great works of literature are always exploring that sort of question, the what-if questions. And I think for the social analyst, the what-if questions immediately lead one to ask why that if and not some other ifs. And so the we question, whose job is it to envisage the institutions, and why assume that there are or are not institutions? I mean, institutions are thick on the ground like weeds. I mean, it's just that, anthropologists investigate them a certain way, and IR theorists, international relations theorists, investigate them in a completely different way. And then the two ways tend not to talk to one another. So international relations theorists may detect a vacuum of institutions where an anthropologist going in would find, well, actually, there are lots that are thick on the ground, and why don't we cultivate some of these ones rather than some of those other ones that you're reaching for. I think one of the things that I would like to say about science and technology is that tacitly embedded in a lot of the ways in which scientists think about morality is perhaps a hubristic element, that if there are going to be institutions, they should be sitting in the driver's seat of those institutions. Yeah. One of the things that the Oppenheimer movie brings to light is the degree to which even the taking on of responsibility itself was seen by some people as itself hubristic, right? Yeah. I mean, that is, why was it Oppenheimer's job? And in the film, there is a certain, I don't want to produce spoilers for people who haven't seen it, but there is a certain amount of tension around different perceptions of why this man was wanting to glorify the Los Alamos moment. And it's, the biologists who came 50 years later have gone back to that to say that we don't want our Los Alamos moment. Yeah. But the we is the biologists. Yeah. And this is something that I've been, to some degree involved in pushing back against, saying, sorry, if there's one thing that became clear from the nuclear debate, it's that these debates have to be much more widespread. They can't be just the scientists talking to the scientists, because only we can calculate the risk of whether we're going to set the Earth's atmosphere alight or not.
Well, your invocation of calculation here, I have to go back to that famous line where people sort of dismissed Bohr and others who were looking more at the ethical, philosophical implications of these inventions, many of them going back to quantum mechanics. And the refrain was, shut up and calculate. Don't worry about these things, which got us the bomb, and got us perhaps in some of our most disastrous, unanticipated, events. But I'm just wondering, you invoked my tribe, my clan, the international relations theorist. I plead semi-guilty as someone who's been fighting against that rationalism for many, many years. But two little anecdotes. One is, there was a famous conference, 1989, the Fall of the Wall. Leading international relations theorists all gathered at this Ivy League university. We'll go unmentioned as will names. And this event is presented to them. And the refrain from probably one of the leading figures was, it's only one data point. Why do we have to, we don't know anything yet. It's just one data point. And so it just sort of dismissed, first of all, the agency, the will, the people who made this happen. But it also turned it into simply, let's wait and see, as opposed to let's support, let's learn from this. So I think you're right. And also I invoke tribe and clan because I think we do need more anthropologists. So maybe because they don't use ethics so much, they use words like norms, rituals, taboos. Maybe we should just get rid of ethics, the word. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm always against the idea of getting rid of things. They evolve anyway. You may not know that I have a PhD in historical linguistics as well.
Oh, and I stand corrected here.
That teaches one to be a little bit humble about predicting what should happen to language. It just happens. So I don't think we're going to get rid of the word ethics soon. It's in what ways do we start to thicken our understandings of what it is that the ethical deliberations ought to be doing.
Yeah.
And the first level point is that who is in those deliberations is all important. And we need to diversify the forums and also the kinds of questions being asked. So what is the risk of extinction comes quite far down a chain of decisions that already has decided that we're going to produce a weapon that, mass destruction was not a word, but it becomes a term.
Yeah.
And maybe we should pay attention to those moments of emergence of language as well. So you're undoubtedly familiar with Carol Cohn's article about moving into the defense community and learning how to talk like them,
Yes.
and then how to remove moral responsibility from language. So instead of talking about the disappearance or doing away with a word like ethics, more attention to the ways in which what that word stands for gets erased, possibly through the production of other kinds of technical languages that prompt people to think that, well, what we're doing after all is what you mentioned earlier, just shut up and calculate.
Yeah. Well, we're going to go to see if there's some questions from our audience and chat in a minute. But I just wanted to pursue this a little further, that we've been enjoined by our Department of Foreign Affairs and in partnership with India to look at the ethics of emerging technologies. And we decided to call it meta-ethics, to say that what most importantly isn't to believe there's like one size fits all, plug and play. You know, you put the 10 commandments on the wall of what you should do and shouldn't do, and that will suffice. As you pointed out in your work, it's often designed into the technology. It involves all kinds of, political choices. But and also, of course, monetary, choices about profit. But I'm just wondering, do you see right now, there is a big push that we're moving towards like an ethics washing, that we can feel good about having more ethics, of this type that's very singular and thin as opposed to thick? Or do you see there's going to be more of a demand for like new institutions, global institutions, perhaps, as was envisioned after the nuclear weapon was first used? What's your take on that? I mean,
well, I think that the demands for a new kind of ethical discourse are going to increase simply because many more people are. I mean, partly one has to say that the first generation of people actually did us a service by pointing out that these discussions should be made more public. And as a result, I think people are indeed aware of things like stem cell technologies and information technology and the new data systems to a degree that was not imagined before. So I think that the demand, for instance, one sees that in the rise of indigenous claims all over the world, urging that there are different value systems where things are priced and costed out differently from the ways in which the advanced industrial societies might have done. And that is actually feeding its way into all kinds of pretty ordinary, hoary type scientific advisory bodies. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, at some point started taking indigenous voices on board. I think that would have been unimaginable 20 or 30 years earlier. So I think some movements of that sort are happening, whether they lead to the kind of deep-seated and what I think is essential recursive thinking about futures that go backward to rethink the plot line of the future. That is more the kind of question. So what sorts of institutions should we have? Not just should we have them and should other people be included. I think the answer to those questions is loud and clear already. But supposing we have them, what's business not as usual in the ethics apparatus that has itself become a kind of bureaucracy, a big, international bureaucracy?
Well, I don't know. For me, it sort of triggers the notion, a very, some ways, archaic law and economics of uneven development, that you can skip over stages, for instance. You can have collapsing of stages when we were talking about linear progression. So it might come from indigenous, communities. It might come from those who haven't followed the same path of economic development, that you see these leaps. But what I worry about is how much of the new technologies are dependent upon using information as a free commodity. Everybody talks about free data, but it's not really free. It's being taken from people in some ways through social media, and then being used for generative AI, then it's being used to further, increase profits for various purposes that aren't necessarily for the public good. So I'm just wondering, are there different conceptions of what's free here and what should not be free in terms of people taking my identity and using it to create this, large language learning models and neural nets that are going to further erode perhaps my freedoms.
So I think that words like free that seem to carry a kind of universalist meaning always need to be queried. Free to do what? Free from what? The idea that freedom is never freedom without constraints is quite well established after all. Under the name of free speech these days, an awful lot of behavior on social media gets tolerated by people who seem not to know that the very first thing you learn in law school is that free speech is not about being able to say anything you please, anywhere you please. Do not shout fire in a crowded theater is, probably the first thing that a law student learns about the First Amendment and how it's not absolute even in the United States. So I think that freedom is another of those theoretically loaded words that invites us to say, first, the descriptive questions, from what, to do what, where, when, why, but then the second order institutional questions that I think that the political world should always be asking. And whose right is it to determine this? Under what forms of accountability? This is partly the reason why I think that what we need to have is something much more like a constitutional debate around technologies. So not just accepting that, we have a right to freedom and therefore, that's just a matter of defining what the nature of that freedom should be, but to understand that at one and the same time we're producing technologies that are altering our very understanding of what it means to be an autonomous agent at all. Generative AI, of course, is on everybody's lips these days. It's surprising to me that people say AI without even for a moment questioning what kind of intelligence is the intelligence that we're putting into AI. And yet, the sort of lessons that even we in academia are now being invited to go through. Suddenly this is completely new this academic year, that we're all being told to, go to sessions in which we can learn, how to detect plagiarism and so on and so forth. But there's an assumption there of what the eye of AI is doing for students, what they will be tempted to take on board. Why are those the things? That is, why are people thinking that shortcuts are the right way to use intelligence? There's a prior assumption that society values speed, and if you can produce n number of widgets, where previously it was n-1, then you have a better society. But, where are those assumptions coming from? I think those are the things we need to pause and...
We know the dangers there of a world full of paper clips without humans.
Well, exactly.
Super intelligence. But,
and no paper either.
No. Paper will be an archaic technology. I guess then the one of the questions that has always bothered me about the artificial intelligence is that it displaces or takes our attention away from what we consider to be one of the side, not unintended, but side consequences of, this data scraping, this new algorithms. And that is basically weaponizing data for political purposes and to undermine democracies. Is disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, a greater threat than artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence doing it, of course, makes it happen faster. But it seems like it's taking our eyes off perhaps what we thought before to be one of the graver dangers of information technology being sort of turbocharged here by not just supercomputing and, but maybe even when, quantum technologies evolve.
So I'm a kind of old-fashioned humanist, and I think any time a discourse forces us to look away from the human and instead think about an abstraction, there's something wrong happening. So information is one of these words that make, that are somehow, it's like washing your hands in a church basin and suddenly cleaning yourself of whatever the sin was. But it's not, nothing is information without there being a prior frame. And that frame, the framings, are human creations. I mean, this is what Kurosawa's great insight was when he filmed Rashomon. You know, the same event seen from multiple different perspectives problematizes, well, what was information from whose point of view, and why did it count as evidence, and what was the story being told? So the kinds of things I think we should focus on are who is generating, who's producing this stuff called information, and what is being taken account of and what not. There is that famous quotation of Robert Kennedy, the father and not the son.
We don't want to get in trouble here.
In which he talked about what the GDP measures or not. Yeah. And he said that it doesn't measure things like the strength of our marriages and the beauty of the play of our children or the value of trees in our lives. And, economists, of course, have become alerted to that sort of problem, probably a generation after Bobby Kennedy said those lines. Yeah. So we do learn slowly. But I think that the bigger point about information is that it's a dangerous word unless we also keep in mind this analytic repertoire all the time, asking, why is this information of value, and where does the valuation system come from? Where does even the epistemic choice to call this information in the first place come from? I mean, why isn't it just a signal that we ignore? And if we would ignore it, but somebody who's collecting it does not ignore it, isn't that an ethical moment? I think that's what the Gonzalez case about the right to be forgotten is about. That there are certain forms of information that we actually choose to ignore, and there's something wrong with preserving it for posterity in ways that human beings, if they had been allowed their sense of autonomy, how do I live my life with a kind of Kantian freedom to evolve myself, to be myself in charge of the next moment of my destiny?
Yeah.
If Google is doing it for me, that is a kind of displacement. And I think that that's the danger of this word information. It ignores the fact that by, sort of taking the version of you, James, even at this moment, and fixing it, there is a kind of act happening that, given a choice, maybe you would not have wanted to have happen that way.
Well, having been immersed in the quantum world for over decades now, I'm in a permanent state of probabilities and flux and hard to nail down, I hope. But I do think that we make our destiny to a certain extent. Of course, we make it under circumstances not under our control. But I want to get back to this question, though, of, at one level, it's about the ethics, but it's also about the complexity. When someone says, shut up and calculate, they're saying, we're going to make it simpler for you. This adds up here, this doesn't add up. This is symmetrical, this isn't symmetrical. But increasingly, we're dealing with very, very complex technologies. Or maybe this is, again, it's just a cultural bias I have. But it used to be you could get under the hood of a car and fix it. Nobody now can even open up most smartphones or understand it. So I'm just curious, what's the role of complexity and the ethics of that, and how perhaps, the second part of the question would be, how do you encourage or develop the kind of teaching of fluency that's required?
Well, I'll talk like a lawyer for a moment, because I think that the single word that comes to my mind in connection with this is delegation. First of all, it's a peculiarly American myth that it used to be possible for anybody to get under the hood of a car and fix it. I think it was probably already quite gendered. I've been struck for a long time at how many of those Los Alamos physicists were young men that had spent their time taking radios apart.
Yes.
But like, who did it? And, much, much, much later, it turned out that one of the reasons that computer scientists were so male in the earliest years of the computer science revolution was that they were being given the computers or their precursors to play with, and the girls were not. And, there have been concerted attempts. I know that my earlier university, Cornell, made a distinct effort to increase the number of women in computer science and succeeded over a fairly short time in increasing the numbers to, from almost nothing to 30%, by trying specifically to make up for those kinds of early conditioning times. So, the question of who was able to look under the hood is probably a good question for history of technology and would reveal something about the same kinds of imbalance about, who gets to ask which kinds of questions. But one way that we've tried to get around this in a complex society is by not having to do everything on our own. And there are all kinds of times when we all rely on calculation. I mean, certainly I've lived in Berlin for extended periods of time without ever needing a car because I know that the Berlin buses will come at every 12 minutes and we'll stop and, the doors will open and I won't have to worry about, 6 of them coming very close together and then nothing for the next 45 minutes, the way you might in Cambridge, Mass. So calculation has its virtues and we depend on them, but we trust institutions to do those calculations for us. And that is a major kind of achievement. And I think the pandemic has made a lot more people understand the lack of solidity behind these delegations. Why have we entrusted people? Are these the right people to trust? And the disinformation point, I think it's very important to keep coming back to that. I think it's not so much about the fact that anybody can go and shout anything from the rooftops, as they can with social media, but that our ways of understanding who's shouting from the rooftops should be listened to or not listened to, that we've forgotten how to cultivate that capability. And, that is, I think, a very different skill. It's also to do with complexity because we just rely on so many different institutions to do different things. But when I ask my students, why is it that you go into a supermarket and you have a food allergy, but you pick up a carton of soy milk and you don't ask? Most of them have never thought about this. They just assume that the label in the supermarket tells you the truth.
Trust, very important for keeping societies going. We know that. We have some questions. They're rather long. They're very good. It might be my fault. I was asking overly long questions, but here's one.
Okay.
Speaking of language and how we may call attention to the ways in which what ethics can stand for, how can we approach the problem of the way in which ethics in the hands of the powerful is often wielded as more as a performative, especially when we think of corporations taking on ethical AI and using ethics as a way to signal morality and therefore superiority over other avenues and possibilities for the development of these technologies?
Yeah, I think that's the point you were making earlier, James, about ethics washing, that as soon as something becomes acknowledged as itself a technique, there is a possibility that somebody's just going to say, well, I applied that technique and now I'm home free. I think that the vigilance is needed on the part of societies. I mean, and to some degree, of course, we can ensure this through law. So is it all right for the legal system to say, yes, this corporation can go ahead and do what it wants, provided it has set up its own ethics committee? I mean, are we happy with a Facebook that says, oh, we have the power to adjudicate because we created our own Supreme Court? I mean, I think that sometimes if you subject a Mark Zuckerberg's actions to the kind of bill of particulars that is in the Declaration of Independence, you will find that many of the things that King George was being accused of could be transported wholesale into the conduct of Facebook. But then who's responsible for that? I mean, it's us. It's us saying that we have created de facto entities that behave like ultimate arbiters of power, and we just, this is not a way that we want to go forward.
The Declaration of Independence made me think of a famous Declaration of Independence on the internet a long time ago by John Perry Barlow. Do you remember that?
Yes, Grateful Dead.
He was not a singer, but he was a songwriter for Grateful Dead. Yes, and he was a rancher, Wyoming rancher. I had the great privilege of being on some panels with him, and at the second cyberspace conference, and he produced this, which I think
manifesto.
Still resonates. And perhaps it was too utopian, but aspirational. But it deals exactly with this question of who, by what right, be it the FBI that came to knock on his door to say, are you hacking, before I think the word hacking was even used. By what right do you have to govern, this movement, this group? And there was an element of anarchism to it. And indeed, the first sort of culture or worldview or whatever of the internet seemed to be based more on this sort of utopian, anarchist perspective. But I'm just wondering, is that moment completely lost? Can it be reclaimed? Or, is there another John Perry Barlow out there? Or are we sort of now, it's been so corporatized that the internet is no longer that free space it once was?
So I would throw in one other word, not just anarchist and utopian, but American anarchist and utopian. It speaks to a particular kind of sense of a frontier that may actually have more appeal in Australia. I wonder if a John Perry Barlow could have arisen in India, where questions of caste, ordaining, have a very different idea. It's, after all, a very individualist conception from the beginning of the manifesto, where he addresses modern states as you weary giants of flesh and steel, or something like that. So, why steel? Why not earth? I think it's not a dreamtime imagination of the world that he's questioning. So, the Unabomber just died very recently. It's another kind of anarchy, but that's the running away to the cabin in Montana and hiding out. And, it's, you can say John Perry Barlow was not much of a critic of capitalism, because he assumes that there's a kind of individual escape and full autonomy possible. And I think it's never been the case. After all, the film that was made about social media rightfully, I think, spent a good bit of time on how it is that the initial financial backers were acquired for that enterprise. And today, when you look at American politics, post Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that made it possible to spend untold amounts of corporate money on elections, and then you see who is funding whom, and how political ideologies are being are being weaponized, not through disinformation, but through, pushing money towards candidates who otherwise would not have had a prayer of succeeding. That those are things that I think that the utopian thinking in America has always preferred to sideline. That all of this is happening against the backdrop of a country with not only a capitalist country, but a country with a particular form of capitalism that says whoever's prepared to take the risk, let them go ahead. Yeah. And if they become very, very rich, then eventually, way down the line, they can donate some of their money to a museum or a foundation and feel good about it. But we won't tax them for what they did. The free information that they took from us will have become their property already. And maybe by some back door, we'll find some controls. But in the meantime, we will have perpetuated a kind of society.
Yeah. Well, I always try to end on a high note. I don't know if there is one for this particular question. You've certainly illuminated the dangers, but also the opportunities for, responsible action when it comes to innovation and invention. So I appreciate all of that and helped us to figure out how to deal with the complexities of these issues, but also the technology itself. So I first want to say thank you for that. We are filming this and editing it, and we'll make it available to everybody who had some difficulties getting online. But I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, from CIS, because I know that you're at the end of a great Australian adventure. Professor Jasanoff just did an Australia road trip up and down the continent, and showed my own ignorance about how little I know still about this country. So I think that you brought that depth. You are, in many ways, an ethnographer of technology. I think that you're the doyen of social science and technology studies, but science technology studies. But I also think this is an important lesson for us, is to get up close and look at the behaviors and not sort of reduce it just simply to the numbers.
And I think that is the high note to end on, because I think there are a lot more people who are aware of the myriad ways in which technology affects their lives and are thinking in creative ways. And I think that our job sitting in universities is to provide the additional resources to, somehow systematize that thought and teach people to ask questions that they might have not chosen to ask before. That's, after all, a kind of classic way of opening up the space of invention.
Yeah, it happens in the classroom. Right? That's what I always say. So thank you so much. We hope to get you back for another, maybe next time you go from Perth to Sydney rather than from Melbourne to Darwin.
That would be difficult.
Yes, that's a big country. So thank you very much, and thank you for everybody who joined us. This will be available on the Project Q website, and we look forward to any comments you might have then. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but once again, we're very grateful to Professor Sheila Jasanoff for coming at the end of her great adventure and spending some time with us. So thank you, and come back for our next event, which will be posted on our website, either projectqsydney.com, or just go to the University of Sydney website for the Center for International Security Studies. So thank you all, and thank you, Sheila.
Thank you very much.
And until we see each other again, over and out. Thank you.